Have you ever seen something like this and was not sure on what it means? In this video, we will go over the concept of histogram, how to read it, and how to use it for checking the exposure on our shots. At the end of this video, I will also give you some quick tips as to what to look for when we are evaluating a histogram. Hey, Lucas Lobato here, and welcome to another video on the Photography for Beginners series. In last week's video, we talked about exposure and how to check the exposure before taking the picture using the light meter of your camera. And we have seen that using different metering modes will give us different results. In this video, we will discuss my preferred method for checking the exposure, which is using the histogram. Let's start from the beginning. What is histogram? The histogram is a representation of tonal distribution of all the pixels in an image. The left extreme of the histogram represents pixels that are pure black, 0% brightness, and the right extreme represents pixels that are pure white, 100% brightness. At both ends, we don't have any details, and we should avoid having too much pixels on these areas to prevent from clipping highlights and shadows. More on that later on in this video. In between these extremes, we have all the other pixels that are represented by shades of gray. The histogram is basically a plot that shows how the brightness of the image is distributed between pure whites, grays, and pure blacks. Let's see a couple of examples so we can understand it a little bit better. I have marked here the pure blacks and pure whites on the histograms. Just by looking at these, can you tell already which image is brighter? One of them has more pixels closer to the blacks and other closer to the whites, so we can guess which one is brighter and which one is darker. That's a good start. Moving forward, we need to divide the histogram into regions to get an idea on how we can read our exposure. Before though, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Let's see an example here where we can break down the different areas of the histogram. So there are 256 divisions on the brightness axis of the histogram, and the values range from 0, which represents the pure black on the left, to 255, representing pure white on the right of the plot. Between the two extremes, we have, starting from left to right, the blacks, the shadows, followed by the midtones, and then the highlights, and finally the whites. To form the histogram, each one of the pixels of the image is represented by its brightness value and placed in one of the divisions I mentioned before. The more the pixels that falls into a particular division, the higher the peak formed for that division in the histogram. Let's get back to our examples. Looking at the examples, we can see now how the pixels are distributed across the blacks, shadows, midtones, highlights, and whites. We now have a stronger feeling about which one of the pictures is brighter than the other, correct? Okay. We know now how to read the histogram, but how can we use it to check whether a picture is properly exposed or not? First thing we need to do is to assess the scene we want to take a picture of. We need to evaluate, are there really bright areas? Are there really dark areas? Are the light conditions somewhat constant across the frame? If there are any really bright areas, we should see some spikes to the right of the histogram around the highlights and whites. Maybe there are some white clouds and the sun is present on the scene, for example. If there are really dark areas, we should see some spikes on the left of the histogram around the shadows and even some in the blacks. As an example, perhaps we have parts of a landscape that are covered from the sunlight causing some dark shadows and areas where we can't see any details. If there is not much contrast on the scene, then we might have a histogram that's somewhat broad and well distributed along all different areas, range from the blacks all the way to the whites. The point of assessing the scene is that we know that the histogram is a representation on how the pixels are distributed in our image according to their brightness. So by comparing it with the actual scene, we can have a very good idea on how the histogram should be. And then, by only looking at it, we can check the exposure and make the necessary adjustments if we need to brighten or darken the picture. Let's take a look at some pictures and analyze their histograms so we can understand better what I meant by assessing the scene. I just want to point out that these are pictures straight out of the camera, without any editing or post-processing done, to illustrate how the histogram would look without any corrections applied. Take a look at the whole scene here. There is no direct light as this picture was taken on a treed area right before sunset. Because of that, there are no bright areas, which means that there are no whites and there is just a little bit of highlights. We should expect the histogram to be shifted towards the midtones and shadows. Notice how it has almost no blacks either. Even before I took this picture, I knew that I would not get much highlights, whites and blacks. So I know that my histogram would be concentrated in the shadows and midtones. If I had seen something else on my histogram, I would know that my settings were not right and I would fix it before taking another shot. Okay, on this next one, we have a mountain with a cloud against blue skies, and there is direct sunlight hitting portions of the scene. Because of the direct sunlight, and as we have clouds on this frame, we will have some very bright areas. Notice that the direct sun also casts shadows, creating dark areas on the trees and grass on the foreground. The mountain is the subject of the picture, but the sun is not shining over the face I was shooting, so the light there is somewhat even. The sky is bright, and there is little variation in terms of overall brightness of it. With all of that, we can expect a broad histogram, with skies on the midtones to highlight, the mountains probably in the midtones and shadows, the clouds on the highlights to whites, and the trees and grass covering all the way from blacks to highlights. If I have noticed many spikes on the whites or maybe a big gap on either side of the histogram after taking the shot, I would know that my exposure would be off and I would play with my settings to get the proper exposure. With that, we covered basically everything we needed in terms of evaluating the exposure through the histogram. Now let's dive in a little bit more on other things that we might want to check when evaluating a histogram. Look at this histogram here. Notice that there is a gap on the left side of it. This gap indicates that there are no dark areas on the picture, and it shows us that if we want, we can adjust our settings to bring the exposure down to cover more of the histogram without losing any details. Of course, it depends on the scene and what we want for the shot, and maybe we want to leave the exposure the way it is. At this point, it's up to the photographer. Note this other one here now. This histogram has the same gap, but it is on the right side of it, which means that we don't have many highlights or bright areas in our photo. If we want, we can tweak our settings as to move the histogram towards the right to increase the tonal range of the picture. Once again, it will depend on what we want for the shot. Both of the gaps mentioned before can mean that our picture is over or underexposed, and we might be shifting the histogram towards the areas of pure white or pure blacks, and losing details on these areas that cannot be recovered during post-processing. Sometimes we will see some peaks at the very extreme left or right of the histogram, like these histograms here. When this happens, we say that we are clipping the shadows or the highlights, which means that we are losing details on these areas by either over or underexposing the shot. If this is happening, we need to adjust our settings to either bring the exposure down if we are clipping our highlights, or up if we are clipping our shadows. But what if we have a situation where both of them are clipping? In this case, my personal preference is to clip the shadows, as clipped highlights look really unnatural to me, as they will show in the picture as pure white areas with no details at all, like these clouds on this picture here. Keep in mind that if we're shooting a scene where the sun is in the frame, we can have highlights clipping as the sun is super bright and we would not expect to see any details on it. On the other hand, we all have seen some dark areas where we could not see any details, so it feels a little bit more natural to have it on pictures. Look at the picture I took at Moraine Lake. We have some shadows clipping, but they are in areas where we don't expect to see details, because this picture was shot on the sunrise and there was almost no light other than the pinkish tones on the very tip of the peaks. Before I end this video, I need to touch on some other points. First, I would like to highlight here that there is no such a thing as a right or wrong histogram, and that the histogram is not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. Like we discussed before, different scenes will have different histograms, and by assessing the scene before taking the picture, we can have a better idea about the shape of the histogram, and then we can check whether our image is properly exposed or not. I'm saying this because I have seen some people saying that the ideal histogram would have pixels ranging from pure blacks to the pure whites, with no gaps on the extremes and without any clipping. But that's more like a general guideline than anything else. As we have seen here, there are situations that we don't have a very broad histogram, or the picture will have more pixels concentrated in some portions of the histogram, and the exposure of the picture is just right. Look at this picture here and its histogram. I don't think we could get shadows or blacks on this picture without underexposing it. The exposure for me is just fine the way it is, and the histogram is compatible with the actual scene, and that's what I was looking for. Another example, there are spikes on the blacks and on the highlights, with a little bit of the image situated on the brighter area of the midtones. The exposure is exactly where it should be for what I have planned for this shot, as there is quite a bit of contrast due to the sunlight hitting only the mountain and not the foreground. Someone could take a look at the histogram without looking at the picture and say that the histogram is wrong. But for me, it's just right. Another point I want to make is that sometimes we can recover details from shots that are under or overexposed using Lightroom and other post-processing software. I will get in more details about this topic in next week's video, so stay tuned if that's something you are interested in. So that's all for today, folks. As always, if you enjoyed this video and learned something useful, give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you all, and I will see you on the next video.